This is Chattanooga Civics. I'm Nathan Bird. The City of Chattanooga is kicking off its budget write-in process for the 2023 fiscal year. I sat down with Brent Goldberg, Chief Financial Officer for the city, to discuss the process the city uses to write its budget, how that process has changed over time, and how citizens can give our input. But first, I'm excited to announce the first ever Chattanooga Civics sponsor, Juicy Rhino. Juicy Rhino is a podcast started right here in Chattanooga, documenting the strange but true story behind all those shady marketing companies that regularly post too good to be true job ads, but never actually mention what it is that they market. Over the course of 7 episodes, the podcast unravels the world of multi-level marketing, investigating the cult-like strategies used to recruit and retain new hires, and how the same company sheds its bad reputation and recycles itself over and over. Juicy Rhino is a serious investigation, but it plays like a dark comedy, and it's a blast to listen to. You can find it on all the major podcast platforms. And we are live, so if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Brent Goldberg. I'm the city's chief financial officer, and we are kicking off budget season right now.
And this is for fiscal year 2023. Can you explain, or 2023, that's right?
Yes, yeah, fiscal
year. Explain
year.
kind of what that means and what those dates are.
Yeah, so the city operates on a fiscal year that's different from the calendar year. So our fiscal year starts July 1st each year. So we just finished the midway point of fiscal year 22 and at the end of December. So the new fiscal year is July 1st, 2022 through June 30th, 2023. So we are starting the process now to prepare the budget for fiscal year 23, which starts July 1st.
Great. And so I was looking at some of the resources that the city has put online about the new budgeting process. And one thing that stood out to me pretty quickly is that the budgeting process this year seems to be pretty strongly anchored in the One Chattanooga strategic plan. So could you tell us a little bit about that plan, how it's going to be implemented in the process, and how people can find more about that?
Yeah, so the One Chattanooga strategic plan there's been a soft release to the public. It's on the pbb.chattanooga.gov website, and the mayor has talked about it at city council and some other places, but we had a public unveiling scheduled for this week actually, and we ended up postponing it because of COVID numbers. So we're going to reschedule that soon, but essentially what it is we call it a strategic plan, but it's not prescriptive. It's meant to be a broad vision. When the mayor put this together, he really wanted to provide a guideline for the departments to use. And so a broad vision, not prescriptive. It's meant to change over time. It includes 11 principles that he really cares about. And it also includes 7 goals and 40 key priorities. So it's quite a bit it's a 40-page document, quite a bit of information, but it's really meant to spur thinking and create guidelines for the departments.
Great. And so you mentioned that acronym PBB a second ago. pbb.chattanooga.gov is where that strategic plan kind of lives right now and where people can access it. But that outcome is priority-based budgeting, correct?
Yes, priority-based budgeting.
And so in past years, the city has used budgeting for outcomes, and now we're shifting to priority-based budgeting. Just kind of very briefly in layman's terms, what are the difference between these two systems? How is it really going to affect how the budget is written and what the kind of final product looks like?
Sure. So priority-based budgeting is a public sector alternative to zero-based budgeting. So people talk about zero-based budgeting quite a bit in the private sector. It is essentially what that means is you start from zero every year and build a budget based on, what you want to accomplish for that year. In the public sector, you can't really start from zero. For us, we can never have 0 police officers or 0 firefighters or 0 garbage truck drivers because those are, the core services we're expected to provide for taxpayers. Just like a school district can't have 0 teachers, right? So the thought is to create a public sector budgeting process that simulates zero-based budgeting to get more of the private sector, budgeting techniques involved in the public sector. So priority-based budgeting is just that. It's an alternative zero-based budgeting focused on priorities, focused on investing taxpayer dollars toward those strategic priorities. But also, it's about getting the services right, making sure that there's three critical questions we want departments to ask themselves: what do we do? What does it cost? And how well does it align to our strategic plan? And that's really part of the key principles of priority-based budgeting. One part of One Chattanooga is one of the 7 goals is to have a responsive and effective government. So we'll see a lot of that this year, I think, through the priority-based budgeting process. We really want departments to focus on what they do, doing it really well, making sure we understand what the cost is to do it, being transparent, and also aligning things with the strategic plan as much as we can. And that may just mean being more responsive and more effective, or it may mean one of the other key priorities that's listed in the plan.
Mm-hmm. So kind of getting further into the details of the budget writing process, the city writes an operating budget and a capital budget. Is that correct? Do I have those terms right?
Yeah.
So what is the difference between the operating budget and the capital budget? How are the funds raised, and then how is it spent? And what is kind of the demarcation between those two?
Yeah. So the primary, I'll back up. So, the government's composed of several different funds, and we can get in the weeds on what the different funds are if you want. But the general fund is the primary fund that is used to provide all the services that people expect. That's where we fund everything from police and fire to public works to planning to even agency appropriations, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. But the general fund last year for fiscal year 22, the current year that we're in, had a total revenue of $302 million. And that $302 million is made up primarily of property taxes and sales taxes, both state, our portion of state taxes plus our portion of local sales taxes. So property taxes make up, I had a note here somewhere, 62% of our revenue, and then state and local sales taxes make up 24%. So 86% of our revenues for general operations come from 2 sources: property taxes and sales taxes. And then we have other fees and local taxes that make up the rest, and grants from the state or federal government sometimes. And then we spend, we always have a balanced budget. So if we have $302 million coming in, then we budget to spend that same amount, $302 million. And for fiscal year 22, in this order, police, fire, and public works take up around 70% of the budget. Those are the largest departments and provide most of the services that impact people on a daily basis. So that is our operating budget. And then capital budget is separate. The funding sources for that are primarily bonds. So if, when the city issues bonds, we get that cash up front so we can spend it on large capital projects. And then we repay that over a period of years. Then we also get grants, federal and state grants for capital projects. And then most years we take some portion of our current year revenue and put that into capital. It's called pay-go capital, or pay-as-you-go. So we may use that money for, we may move $3 million from operating revenues into a capital project just so we can get it done quickly and not have to go through the bonding process and everything. So, but the capital budget is for everything from paving roads to building sidewalks, building new parks, new playgrounds. So kind of
build it and you're done.
Yeah, the one-time expenditure type thing, non-recurring. So that's operating capital. And then we also have several other funds that are enterprise funds. The largest that is really, really important, but people don't normally talk about it very much because, it's not as fun to talk about, but the sewer fund. So sewer fund is half the size of our general operating fund. I mean, it's over $150 million, and it's funded. It's called an enterprise fund because it mirrors more like a private enterprise. There's fees that come in from ratepayers that pay sewer fees, and we spend that money on the sewer system to operate the sewer system and also for capital projects. So that's a big one. We also have an economic development fund and some other smaller funds like hotel motel tax. And all of those are very specific revenue sources and very specific uses of those revenues.
Right. So I've got a couple questions. I want to prevent myself from getting too into the weeds on some of these answers, but a couple questions just to clarify some things. For the operating budget and that revenue that you're talking about coming from sales tax and property tax and other taxes, is that done on a projection basis? And so whatever we're projected to make for 2023, that is our budget for 2023? Or is it, we made this much money in 2022 and we're going to roll that over and spend that money in 2023?
Yeah. So, well, one, I'll answer that in two parts. One, any money we have left over from fiscal year 22. So we typically run a surplus. So I don't even know the last time we ran a deficit, but generally whatever money we bring in, we spend less than that. So that difference goes into our fund balance. Mm-hmm. And our unrestricted fund balance right now is, or at the end of fiscal year 21, it was close to $100 million. And that's basically a rainy day fund. So if we have a huge economic crisis or natural disaster or anything like that, we've got that money sitting aside to use for rainy day. So that's where funds roll into at the end of each year if they're not used. For the revenues for the next year, so for fiscal year 23, we will prepare revenue projections that are, fairly complex projections for some of it. And then some of it is, we think it'll go up 1 or 2%. It just depends. Like property taxes are pretty stable. They're not subject to economic conditions very much, other than when we had the real estate bubble.
Right. If there's like a huge like market wide.
So property taxes though are generally stable. They generally go up 2 to 3% each year. 2.5% is pretty good estimate for that, and that's just to capture new property that comes online. So there's constantly houses and commercial buildings being built. Mm-hmm. So there's constantly properties that get added to the tax rolls. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty stable. Sales taxes, they've continued to increase significantly over the past couple of years. It's we budgeted for during COVID for fiscal year 21. It was very conservative on that budget, thinking that we would have some economic issues, and it was quite the opposite. We brought in more sales taxes than ever, when I guess with the federal government giving people money to spend, and people were not able to go on vacation and do those sorts of things, so they spent it on stuff.
Stayed home and spent it here.
Yeah, it's interesting. All the home improvement stores had record years, and there's a lot of sales taxes that get paid. If you're buying $2,000 worth of stuff at Home Depot, you're paying 10% of that sales tax goes into the state and city. Liquor store sales were at all-time high because people weren't going out to restaurants. Instead, they went to the store to buy stuff. So we had a really significant increase in sales tax collections, and we're continuing to see that now so far, at least through December of 21. We know inflation's becoming real for people, and that will have some impact on consumer spending. So, but I still think sales taxes will likely remain at least flat, compared to last year. And then some of the other things, are, even though they're smaller dollar amounts, they're a lot harder to project. So we really kind of dig in and try to determine what is going to happen for things like business licenses or other smaller taxes and fees that we collect.
And then one other question on these details for the capital projects budget. You mentioned bonds. Mm-hmm. Where does that bond repayment get filed away? Does that go under the operating budget because it's kind of a recurring cost, or does it stay under the capital budget?
That's a great question. It is in the operating budget as a debt service. So within our operating budget, we have a section called General Government. And General Government is primarily debt service, some of our cost for, we allocate healthcare cost and pension cost, throughout the departments, but General Government houses like our purchasing department, IT department, those things that are kind of centralized functions. But we also have our largest chunk is debt service, and that's just an account within General Government. And so we know on a daily basis what our debt service is going to be each month, because we have bonds outstanding. We have several bonds outstanding. I don't have a list with me, but I mean, lots of different bonds that we've issued over the past 10, 15 years, and we refinance those sometimes to extend them out. But that debt service lives in the operating budget. So we, from a budgetary perspective, we actually fund the debt service first. So, if we have $300 million coming in and our debt service is, say, $20 million, that means we only have 280 available, right? Debt service is first, then we move to all the essential salaries. I mean, it's one of our largest costs is salaries and benefits, very people-driven organization. All governments are, really. So that lives there. We just issued bonds, which this is interesting, so I just want to mention. We just issued bonds, and our combined interest rate was less than 1%. So it's the cheapest we've ever issued bonds for. I think it was 0.74% was our combined interest cost. So it's, it's almost like getting free money. So a huge portion of those monthly payments or annual payments that we're going to be making just goes to the principal. Very little interest that we'll be repaying.
I want to move on and talk about kind of the public input process and talk about how citizens can kind of get involved with the budget writing process. What, I guess early on, what is the schedule format and kind of how is that information going to be used to write the budget?
Yeah, so we have, first thing I'll say is, we get public input throughout the year, right? I mean, we get calls into the mayor's office. Right. Sometimes, I don't want to call them complaints, but people bring issues to our attention, right? All throughout the year, we get calls to the mayor's office, emails. We hear from city council members all throughout the year about what they're hearing at their community meetings and from their constituents. So I think sometimes people overlook that we constantly are getting public input, and the key is, do you use it or not, right? Do we actually respond to it? So we get that throughout the year, but then we do provide opportunities for people to, very specific opportunities for people to provide input. This year, we're doing 3 virtual sessions. We originally planned to do those in person. We had everything lined up at community centers and the library, but because the COVID numbers were continue to be so high, we moved them all to virtual. So they're all through Zoom. You can register for them on our website. If you go to Chattanooga.gov, we have a splash page on the front page where you can click to it, or go to the finance department. But you can register for the Zoom sessions. We just had our first one was on January 24th. We had a decent group. It was about 30 people. And we heard about things like slowing down traffic and, just some of it's things you expect to hear. And then every now and then you hear things that are just, something you don't expect to hear. Like, we got some commentary about education, which we're not in education per se, but we can help influence education. So that was the first session. The next one is on January 31st. So this coming Monday. And then the last one's on February 10th. And those are all at 5:30 p.m., all virtual. We also have a survey on our website. So I would encourage people to go and fill out that survey. I think that's an easy way for people to provide input. It's online. You can do it whenever you want. And so for us, like, the challenge for us is to take all that input, everything we get throughout the year, plus what we get from these sessions and the survey, and really incorporate that into preparing a budget. And some of the input we get are things that we're going to do anyway, right? Like, for example, every year, no matter what, you get input about road conditions and potholes, right? And so last year we announced, a plan to spend $40 million over 4 years to pave roads, which is the largest investment in road paving, in the modern era. And that's $10 million a year for 4 years, and we'll continue that. We hired a pothole inspector, and of course, going back to the campaign, we got lots of input during the campaign. Mayor Kelly heard all kinds of stuff when he was out door knocking and going to events, and we've captured all that, and we still have that information. But like, we hired a pothole inspector, and that was a direct response to people, saying, I'm tired of potholes. And it sounds silly to have a pothole inspector, but there's quite a bit of people in Chattanooga don't call things in. Like, there's neighborhoods where we never get 311 calls, and for various reasons. Maybe they just don't want talk to the government or whatever it is, right? But potholes in those areas never get repaired because we don't know about them. No one ever calls them in. And we used to, years ago, we had someone that proactively, drove around town and put in work tickets for potholes. Also, another problem is people will call in a pothole, and we get there and it's not a pothole. We send a pothole truck out to patch it, but when they get there, it's a road failure. Mm-hmm. So they can't really just patch it.
Right, that's
more additional
bigger
work.
project.
So having someone whose job it is to put work orders in and evaluate these kind of things will actually go a long way. Mm-hmm. So those are examples of responding to some of the input we've heard, but that's where we are right now. We've also done a lot of input when we did for the police chief search, for a couple other things. So I think we've got a tremendous amount of input that mm-hmm. we really need to prioritize into the budget.
Right. And I don't want to get too far off on this tangent, but I do want to just put a plug in for 311 in general for all of our listeners. Just that is one of the best ways to tell the government what is wrong.
Right.
There's a sidewalk here that's cracked. I need it to be fixed. There's a pothole here. I need it to be fixed. There's leaf pickup. I need it fixed. Mm-hmm. And it's all tracked and it's fairly transparent from what I've seen. And, if you can dig into it and see what's being handled and what isn't. So just kind of a sidebar there for all of our listeners. Yeah. Download 311 app or go on the website. And I do want to ask real quick, this isn't really your department probably, but how potholes get prioritized and road maintenance in general gets prioritized. I know that, there's a lot of different people complaining. Yeah. There's a lot of roads. There are some roads that don't actually serve that many people. How does the city determine the priority for what gets resolved when? Since there's only so much money to go around. Yeah. And you don't have to answer that, but if you could kind of point me in the right direction.
Sure. No, I mean, I'm happy
who to talk to about that.
I'm happy to take a stab at it. I've been around here long enough in different roles that I think I can probably answer it mostly intelligently. So there's something called a pavement condition index, mm-hmm. a PCI. And so we have a PCI for every single road in the city of Chattanooga. So the transportation department, they update that regularly. Once something, a 100 means it's like a brand new road, right? Anything over a 70 is a really good condition road. Anything between like 20 and 50, or 20 and 70, or 20 and 60, those are the roads where you got to start making a plan to do repairs or replacement or whatever that is. And then anything below 20, it's almost not even worth paving it because the road really needs to be rebuilt mm-hmm. or reconstructed. A lot of those roads that are under 20 are out in neighborhoods. They don't have as many cars, so they've never been prioritized as high. But, some neighborhoods, that is the one thing that they hate the most because they use the road, right? There may be 3 people that use it, but they use it every single day. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to figure out a way to, add that into the equation. Like, even though this is not used by a whole lot of people, it's been like this for a long, long time, and it's an underserved neighborhood, so maybe we should move it up the list. Mm-hmm. But generally, PCI is the number one indicator. Number 2 is use of the road, like you mentioned. Roads that are much higher traffic count are going to get prioritized over other roads. One, because they deteriorate faster because they have more cars on them. So, and they just serve the most people. So if we're gonna spend the money on paving, we want to make sure that as many people as possible are getting the benefit. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the general way that we look at it.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for indulging me on that. That was a little bit of a tangent, but I feel like it's important. Like you said, that's one of the things that people expect the most is do the roads function.
Now for potholes, it's going to be a different approach. Like we just want to fill every pothole, no matter where it is. Everyone that we know about, we want to fill it. Mm-hmm. And we want to get, and sometimes it sounds cliche, just keep talking about potholes, but potholes really bother people.
Right.
And so that's our goal for potholes is just, get them all into the system and fill all of them. Mm-hmm. And, we may fill a pothole tomorrow and 6 months from now it's a pothole again. Right. And that's because there's some other underlying issue that needs to be resolved at some point. But it's really about, people seeing that if they call this in it gets fixed.
Right.
And that's important. It gives people confidence in the government,
right.
and we can do the simple things effectively.
Mm-hmm. And that is actually a really great lead in to my next question, talking about just confidence in government. A lot of times, especially for people who don't necessarily have time to go to city council meetings, to, read the newspaper every day, things like that. Mm-hmm. It can seem like these public input processes for the budget or for any other, I'm trying to think of other issues that have gone on. There was the COVID response team, there's the police chief search team, all these public input teams, which seems like a really great way for the government to get out and hear the voice of the people that they're supposed to be serving and take that into account and move forward with that information. Sometimes there is the view among a lot of people that that's just kind of a way to package up a bunch of answers and use that to steer towards a predetermined outcome.
Yeah.
How can citizens track this public input process and see how the data that's being collected is actually affecting the outcome? What kind of transparencies are being put in place to make sure that people can see, I complained about A, so A is being addressed, rather than we all complained about A and the city kind of put it through this big process and put it in a black box, and out the other side they say, okay, what the people really want is B.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and we are completely committed to not having a predetermined budget. With that said, though, we do have a pretty large amount of fixed costs, right? Mm-hmm. Salaries and benefits. Mm-hmm. We have to spend X dollars on fuel for fire trucks and police cars. Mm-hmm. And so, even though those are variable, they're variable fixed. Mm-hmm. So we know that there's a lot of things that we just have to, there's a baseline of things we have to pay for. So, and we do have the constraints on revenue. If we could do everything we wanted to do in the one Chattanooga plan next year, like, we would do it, but it would cost way more money than we have. So we don't want to build a predetermined budget, but a portion of it is predetermined. Just, it has to be, because we have a baseline of things we have to cover: debt service, some salaries and benefits, those sorts of things. The input that we get, I think the survey results, we're planning on posting those online. And we're capturing information from these input sessions, and we'll put that information out there as well. I think in the budget document you'll see a section about community input. Like, these are sometimes we try to, even though the things we hear may be not exactly the same, a lot of times they're related. So you can get themes from all the input. So one theme, just, whether people are talking about paving a road or fixing potholes or slowing down traffic, like, road conditions may be a theme that we say, we heard about this and these are the things we're doing in the budget. So we'll have a narrative portion of our budget document that talks about input received and how it's reflected in the budget, to try to build that bridge to show. And then we may have some things that we heard about that we weren't able to put in the budget this year, and actually say that,
right,
and be transparent about that. I think that's important. And I think, the 311 information, that's really a constant public input process. And we've talked internally about ways to make that more transparent and get that out there. We're working on a new 311 app. We want to build a new website, which is it was in our capital budget for fiscal year 22 to build a new website. I mean, we put a significant amount of money in the budget to do that, because they're not cheap to do it right. We want to make sure it's responsive, that it's user friendly, that it's designed well so that people can find things and really participate. So I think once we have all that stuff rolled out, I think it's going to provide a lot of new opportunity for people to more easily connect with government. And then everything that they tell us about through the electronic means, everyone in Chattanooga will be able to see what that is. And you can kind of see that now with a lot of the 311 data. We just want to make it a little more robust and a little easier for people to use and find. And if we track, if we want to start tracking, we do track it, but we want people to be able to see, I put in this 311 request on this day, and it took us 3 days to do it, or it took us 130 days to do it, right? But you can see, how long it takes us, and we're going to be more intentional about measuring that and trying to make sure that those, however long it takes us to get to these work orders is as short as possible.
Right.
So maybe that, I don't know, I might have went on a tangent there,
No, that was good. One thing I do want to dig in just a little bit further there, and you talked at the beginning about how some of these costs are quasi fixed. Different salaries, different departments have certain operating costs. I feel like with government, there can be the tendency to get stuck in a status quo, to say like, this budget is this size and we have this many people, and so that's what we need to continue to fund. And maybe the budget process isn't the right avenue for this kind of questioning, but maybe it is, is this part of the budget process to say, is this department right sized? Is there room to shrink it? Is there room to find some new avenues to get funds, or some new avenues? Maybe it needs to be shrunk.
Yes, definitely. So back to priority-based budgeting process. So typically most governments in the United States, well, in the world really, but most governments use incremental budgeting. There's lots and lots of cities in the U.S. that don't use that process. They use priority-based budgeting or budgeting for outcomes or performance-based budgeting, different variations. But a vast majority of states, counties, and cities use incremental budgeting. That's last year's budget plus 1 or 2%, right? And so there may be line items in the budget that have been, around $5,000 for 50 years. Right. And they may have only spent $10 out of that line item, right? So that is the downfall of incremental budgeting, is just that status quo. Like, this is our budget. It must have to grow, right? And we're not really digging through and making sure that you're realigning things to where they need to be. I mean, because things are different now than they were 20 years ago or 50 years ago. So with priority-based budgeting, some of the principles that we talk about, and that we talk about these things in our meetings with department administrators. I've been meeting with department heads all week this week to talk about where they are in the budget process, do they have questions, and really to push some of the PBB principles. So some of the principles are, to prioritize services, invest in those priorities, question past spending patterns. Like, that's actually listed as a principle of priority-based budgeting. And by the way, priority-based budgeting it's a Government Finance Officer Association best practice. So there's a lot of literature around it and examples and those sorts of things, which is always helpful. But questioning past spending patterns is a big part of it. And what we're asking departments to do is to really look at your budget, determine where you can move money, because it's not that we want to spend less money. I mean, people pay these taxes. They expect to get a return on their investment. So it's not about spending less. It's about reprioritizing and reallocating. So if a department goes to their budget, and if you can find 10 line items where you can shrink that line item by $1,000, then you've got $10,000 to spend on something new. And it could be something innovative to provide better service. It could be to do a specific response to the One Chattanooga plan. It could be lots of things, and whether it's $10,000 or $50,000, it's new money to do something new instead of just sitting in a line item that never gets spent, and then it rolls into the fund balance, right? So we're really pushing departments this year to really think about that, and so far we've had a really good response. I think people are excited about really being able to think outside the box a little bit. The mayor always pushes public entrepreneurship. The Possibility of Why is a book by Mitch Weiss that we all read. He had every department head read it. We talked about it and had discussions, but it's really about applying some of the, some entrepreneurship principles to the public sector. Like, it's okay to have crazy ideas. We're not going to waste money on it, right? I mean, this is taxpayer dollars, so it's a little different. You can't just throw money at things, but we can do, proof of concept. We can do all kinds of things before we spend a bunch of money. And those are the types of things that we're really trying to push throughout the organization, change the culture a little bit.
So talking about all these different departments and how their budgets are written. One thing that this kind of surprised me when I started kind of pulling back the curtain to see how the budget gets written, but each department and also several non-government entities write requests. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you walk us through that process and how those requests are written and what sort of information they have to provide? And also just, what are the guidelines for who can even make a request? Like what is the kind of bare minimum to say I am an organization that can request city budget money?
Right. So all of our departments, the standard basic departments, public works, police, fire, planning, finance, human resources, IT, they all have to submit a departmental request, a general budget request. Mm-hmm. And within that request, in prior years, when they used budgeting for outcomes, they had to submit everything as an offer. It was an offer of services in very specific format, which is great. I mean, and BFO, by the way, is a version of priority-based budgeting. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of the same principles, just a little bit different format and approach. But we're trying to simplify it a little bit, and so departments have to give us, like, what we're saying is we want you to tell us what is your basic minimum services. Like, fire department operations cost this much money, instead of breaking up into smaller, like, we still break it up behind the scenes in the accounting system for mm-hmm. tracking and everything, but from a public view of the budget, like, the fire department operations cost this much money. And it includes this. There's 20 fire stations. There's 440 firefighters. There's operating expenses. They have to submit that kind of information. So they have to put stuff in our system, our Oracle system, on a much more detailed basis. We have fiscal managers in all the departments that do this. And then they have to provide the higher level executive summary that talks about their basic minimum services. We also make them submit performance measures. And these are key performance indicators that they use almost on a daily basis. Like, what do you look at every day or at least every week to make sure your department's operating the way it should be? And then the other thing we've asked them to do this year is to do an equity analysis for their department. And we haven't really defined what that means yet. We're in the process of standing up a full department of equity and community engagement, but we don't quite yet have a chief equity officer on board. But we are asking departments to at least think about it. Like, do you have an approach to equity, whether it's internal diversity or making sure that the services we provide are equitable, whatever that may be. So those are the key components of the budget the budget requests that they have to submit. We're also we're asking departments if they have a priority specific request, like it is direct response to One Chattanooga, high priority, great idea, something new, that's not part of your normal budget. We have a separate request process for that. So it can either be a priority aligned to the One Chattanooga strategy, or it could be an innovation. So, a new way to do something in government, and it might only be $10,000 that they're putting on top of something that's already in their operating budget. It may be something that costs us normally $250,000 a year, but if we only spent $10,000 more, we can make it so much better for the residents. So. Mm-hmm. We have those opportunities as well. And then capital is a separate request. So all the departments have to do all three of those. So that's that group. Mm-hmm. We also have quasi-governmental agencies like CARTA. Mm-hmm. Regional planning agency is one of those. The library, it operates mostly like a department, even though they have a separate board. Mm-hmm. But it's more like a department than it is a CARTA. CARTA is much more of an authority or an agency. They all submit request to us as well. Very similar. I mean, we make them submit, what their total request is, performance measures, those mm-hmm. sorts of things. And then the last group is nonprofits. So the only non-government entities that can get funding are nonprofits. They mm-hmm. have to be recognized by the IRS as a nonprofit. They have to prove that they have 501c3 status. And it can be any size of nonprofit, but they can essentially request anything they want. And they have to provide us quite a bit of information, which we can get to those details if you want. But there's a process. It's similar to the departments, but they have to actually provide even more information because right. we're appropriating money to them. And the way that works, and there's a state law and city ordinance that ties to the state law that says what we do with nonprofits, and it's essentially we give them the money and they go with it, right? I mean, we can ask them for reports and all kinds of things, but once we appropriate it and cut the check, it's theirs.
Right. So one thing that I noticed on that, I was watching the budget kickoff meeting video that was posted a while back, is that there's a new requirement for agencies to have a plan to become sustainable without local government funding. Do I have that right? And I'm understanding that correctly. Yeah. So these nonprofit groups that are asking for city funds have to include in that request, how can we continue to operate without this request in the future?
Yes.
Tell me more about that and why that requirement was introduced and kind of what the hope for timeline is on that in terms of getting these nonprofits independent.
Yeah. It's interesting because this was actually a requirement before the previous administration. Mm-hmm. So they had this as it was part of the request process previous to the prior administration. So we're actually bringing it back. And then we have some council members that asked us about that, wanted to bring it back. But I also think it's just really good for us to do that. You know, we want to make, like, we're not a philanthropic organization. You know, we want to be a good partner, and sometimes it makes sense to have non-government entities to provide services, for lots of reasons. But, you know, we want those agencies to be able to grow and continue to be successful and serve the community without relying on taxpayer money. And most nonprofits can get on some path to get there, whether it's, you know, seeking other private sources or, you know, their donations or their fundraising plans, whatever that is. Excuse me. But, you know, nonprofits have to submit financial statements, audits, list of salaries and positions, 5 years worth of major funding sources. They have to tell us what their other governmental funding sources are. Like, they have to give us quite a bit of information. Right. But then we want them to actually give us a narrative format that says, all right, you know, right now, for example, they could say, for the past 3 years, I've gotten $100,000 a year from the city of Chattanooga for X. Over the next 3 years, you know, we can step that down to $80,000, $70,000, $60,000, and I'm going to replace that revenue with fundraising or, you know, whatever the other source may be. But try to create some sort of path to being successful and continue to serve the community without city funds. There are some nonprofits, though, that will never do that. Like, they're not going to give us they're not going to be able to provide us with a path forward without city funding. So a good example of that would be one of the nonprofit organizations that provides Head Start classrooms. Mm-hmm. That's really an expansion of the city. So we have all the city-run Head Start classrooms, and then we send a portion of our federal money to nonprofits that provide additional classrooms. And that's not really they don't need to be, you know, their path forward without city money is they just wouldn't have classrooms, and we don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. Like we are intentionally expanding our services through the nonprofit community in that way, so that, you know, those are treated a little bit differently. Right. But we want every nonprofit, other than those types, to really think about like how they can be successful without city funding. It's not going to be punitive. I mean, you know, but we at least want to see what that might look like.
Right.
And generally, like last year, we decreased the amount of money we appropriated to nonprofits because we felt like some of it was duplicative. We felt like some of it was just nonprofits getting the same amount of money every year, no matter what. And we really wanted to be, you know, strategically aligned with what we're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. So I understand like why some of these groups would be receiving funding in a case where it is, like you said, with the Head Start program, an expansion kind of on what the city is already doing, or if it's kind of plugging a gap that the city doesn't have a program for. So I want to talk about both those aspects. For something like the Head Start program, where it's an expansion upon a city program, what is the reason that that's being operated through a nonprofit rather than just bringing that money back in and expanding the number of classrooms that the city is funding directly?
So, like, the primary reason is because we do have nonprofits that are already in the early childhood education space, mm-hmm. and they already have facilities, right? So, for us, we would have to build some more facilities.
Right.
We don't have. I mean, we're using all the space we have for that meet the standards of a Head Start classroom. So I think it's a better return to send that money out to qualified nonprofits that already operate in that space.
Right, you're capitalizing on their
capitalizing
expertise
on their
and resources.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Like the Chambliss Center for Children is a great example. I mean, they've been in the early childhood business for 100 years, and they're really good at it. They're well known nationally, and they already have physical space to do this. So that's a good example. And then on the other side, you mentioned like filling gaps. Like, we provide funding to a nonprofit to run a rape crisis center. If we didn't give them the money, we would have to do it ourselves. Like that's something that we have to have. And they already do it. They've been doing it for years, and it makes sense for us to do that in that way. Some others are more contract driven. Like 211 services for example, are run by United Way. If people couldn't call 211 and get somebody on the phone at United Way, we would have to do that ourselves. And that's totally different than 311, right? It's not. 211's connecting people to services, having those relationships. So it makes sense for something like that to be at an outside organization. So that's really our goal, though, is to get down to, all right, what is an expansion that is aligned with our priorities? What's filling gaps? Otherwise, we don't need to be in that arena. You know, it's we need to be spending these funds on things that impact taxpayers the most. Right.
So you're, I guess, constantly making that decision of whether or not this would be something that would be better off under a city umbrella, or if it's better to kind of take advantage of their existing framework. And, is this organization doing a good job with this money?
Right.
Are they doing better than we could do with this money just because they have those relationships and resources built up?
Definitely. Okay. And this year we are implementing something brand new. And that is, we're going to require all nonprofits that receive over a certain amount of money. We haven't exactly defined what that is yet, but let's say it's $300,000. Any nonprofit that gets more than that is going to be required to go through program evaluation. So we'll have a program evaluator who's a city employee that goes through a full program evaluation process for that nonprofit. On-site visits, reviews, those sorts of things. And that's new. We haven't done that before, but we feel like that will really help us get a better understanding of whether or not it's a good investment or if we need to rethink it.
Well, cool. That is all the questions that I have. I guess if you want to talk about kind of the timeline, what is the public input process? We covered that. When is a draft budget going to be available, and kind of what is the process to approval from today onward?
Yeah, so we finished public input like middle of February. Departments have to have their initial request in by February 18th. So that's the day that everyone has to at least have their first draft in. And for some departments, that'll be their final. For others, there will be tweaks here and there. Like, for example, we won't have we have a new, sorry, I just hit the microphone. We have a new parks and outdoors administrator who starts next week, I believe. He will not have an opportunity to really be in the budget process that much for his department. So we'll take time to review that with him after it gets submitted, and we'll probably make some tweaks based on, his experience and preferences and different things. And we'll do that for several departments. But overall, by the end of February, we'll know like what our gap is. And when I say gap, I mean, this is how much money was requested. This is how much we have in revenue, or we project in revenue. So, we can't fund everything. And we'll start going through that process to cut budget requests to get to a draft balanced budget. We're going to meet with city council members individually, like the committee chairs. So, for example, Councilman Byrd is public safety chair. He'll meet with myself and the police chief to go through the police budget, myself and the fire chief to go through the fire budget. And each one of the council members will have that opportunity. That way they kind of get some education about the departments that roll up into their specific committees. And that's something new this year that Councilwoman Burrs suggested. And I think it's a fantastic idea because it really lets the council members get more educated about, the things that they are responsible for as committee chairs. And then they can help educate the other council members as well. So we'll do that around beginning of April. March is really, the full month of March is really that month where we do the back and forth and the tweaking. And then our plan is to have a balanced budget with no changes by April 18th. That always gets pushed out a little bit, but that's why we set it that way. And then we present the budget to City Council on May 3rd. So that is pretty much set in stone. On May 3rd, we will do the public release. Everything will be online. We'll present City Council. Then they will hold budget education sessions all the way through Memorial Day. And the plan is for City Council to vote on the budget on June 7th for the first time and final reading on June 14th. And that gives us a couple weeks cushion in case anything happens. They don't have to approve it until June 28th at the latest to start on July 1st.
Right. Well, cool. Well, thank you very much for your time. Is there anything else?
No, the only other thing I'll mention, just because I think it's worth mentioning, is this is the budget process for our normal budgeted revenues and expenditures. We're gonna have a whole separate process for all of our American Rescue Plan dollars. So the $38 million that we received from the federal government, we've received half of it so far in cash. We get the other half in May of 22, but that's $38 million that will be invested into the community in various ways. We don't know what that is yet because we're going through an entire process through the Chattanooga Equitable Recovery Commission, which Mayor Kelly announced a couple of days ago. And they'll have an entire separate process for getting community input, building a framework, and making recommendations to the mayor. And then we'll have a separate spending plan for that money, totally separate from the regular budget process.
Great. I'll look forward to that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Chattanooga Civics. Our music was written and recorded by Kevin MacLeod. If you have any questions or feedback, please send me an email at chattanoogacivics@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @ChatCivics, or visit the website chattanoogacivics.com. Thanks for listening.